Well, greetings. My name's Judith Stove, and I'm part of the Stoicon-X Melbourne organising team, and I'm here in conversation with Kathryn Koromilas. Now, Kathryn is a Scotland-based writer, ghostwriter, educator, and coach, and rooted in her practice of Stoicism. Her coaching combines ancient wisdom and contemporary narrative theory to help writers of all ages claim authority of their life and stories. And currently, Kathryn is organising Stoicon 2023, Beautiful Stoics, which is going to take place on the 21st of October, which has an amazing lineup. And we'd love to be able to tune in from down under, but of course those time zones make it quite difficult, which is why we have Stoicon-X Melbourne, where this interview is going to air the following weekend on Saturday, the 28th of October. Now, in addition to those qualifications, Kathryn's worked as an English professor, academic writing instructor, arts and entertainment journalist, travel writer and copywriter. Her first novel, Palimpsest, which she wrote while living near ancient Nicopolis, where Epictetus set up his philosophical school, The Healing Place for Sick Souls, was published in 2010. She holds a Master of Philosophy degree in creative writing and is currently enrolled in Metanoia Institute's Master of Science degree in creative writing for therapeutic purposes, with a research interest in autofiction. So thanks, Kathryn, for spending some time with us today. So did I get everything right there?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of recognize yourself when someone's reading a bio of you, but yeah, I think that's pretty factual.
Fantastic. Well, obviously our audience will hear you and realize that you're an Aussie. So would you like to give us a little bit of background about how you came to be living such a long way from Australia?
Yeah. So yeah, I was born and raised in Australia to Greek parents. So I'm second generation Australian. So I guess living a long way from home is part of my genes. Maybe my parents sort of migrated from Greece. Yeah, I actually moved to Greece as an adult, and from there traveled around Europe. Also lived in Beijing and also lived in America, in Boston specifically, and now in Scotland. So I tend to, I guess, move around through relationships. Relationships can either keep you stable within a certain home, or you move due to work and other concerns. And so, yeah, I'm in Scotland in a little cottage by a little cemetery, by a loch. And yeah, here I am.
That sounds so beautiful. And it sounds as though you're really in touch with nature where you are.
Yeah, well, the landscape is quite brutal at times, but these last few days it's been quite sunny and warm, so it's been quite a gentle Scottish landscape. I do a lot of walking and have learnt how to be outside in the Scottish weather. As the great, I call him a stoic comedian, Billy Connolly, says, it's not the weather, but the clothes that you choose to wear. So I've learnt how to dress in layers in Scotland and be able to be out and about with my dog, Henrietta, and just enjoying being outside with her. Yeah, that's me.
Wonderful. So that's how you came to be where you are. What about your interest in Stoicism? I realize you've had an interest in philosophy for some time. So what was it about Stoicism that got you in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've encountered Stoicism on, I think, 3 major occasions in my life, but it wasn't really until the last decade that it really resonated with me. And I think a lot of us coming to Stoicism might come through a personal trauma or some sort of need for healing. So it is a kind of a therapeutic philosophy to a certain extent. But going back Woods for a while, I studied at the University of Sydney, and so this was late 80s, early 90s, and did philosophy on campus there. And at that point, you did Plato and Aristotle, and then you skipped for hundreds of years and went ahead to the Enlightenment philosophers. So I didn't encounter the Stoics on campus at all. But down the road from the University of Sydney, there's a little Greek tavern called Steki. Actually, I think the Steki tavern has closed now just this year. But there's a little Greek taverna, and got to meet many philosophers from the university Sydney there, who'd sort of trek on down and have a kind of philosophical symposium with Greek food and retsina, etc. And one of those philosophers was Dr. Ed Spence. You of course probably know him. Ed is an interesting character. He's actually written a book recently. It's on Stoic philosophy and artificial intelligence, and he looks at the degree, to what degree, technology, and how we can kind of work with technology to flourish and just live well with technology. So it's really interesting text. It's called Stoic Philosophy and the Control Problem of AI Technology. So look out for that one. But anyway, back in the day, back in the early 90s, Ed and I collaborated on presenting philosophy and drama nights at the Stecchi Taverna. And that's where I got to see philosophy on the street, so to speak. So it wasn't quite the Stoa, but it was the next best thing. It was a tavern. And we read from the Platonic dialogues and performed and did philosophy in sort of community at a kind of a symposium type of atmosphere. And Ed is from Cyprus. So he kept going on about this guy called Zeno and how wonderful Zeno was. And so by virtue of just being with Ed and being in that kind of very physical space of doing philosophy in the tavern, I got to have a glimpse of Stoic philosophy, but then promptly ignored it because I was far more interested in Wittgenstein and kind of the more analytical philosophers at the time. Fast forward about maybe 8 years or a decade later, I had moved to Greece and I'd spent some time in Athens, but then moved to Preveza on the west coast of Greece. And Preveza is a city near the ancient city of Nicopolis, which you mentioned in my intro bio, which is a city built by Caesar Augustus after he beat Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. So that's the city where Epictetus ended up after being banished with a whole lot of other philosophers from Rome, and set up his school, a school for healing the soul. So I was living in Preveza and sort of, hiking around Nicopolis, and thought I might go back to the Stoics, and read a bit of Epictetus then. At that time, I think that was the late 1990s, Tom Wolfe, an author, wrote this really big fat novel, A Man in Full.
And that was, I think that was 1998.
Yeah. And Sharon Lebel had just, I think, published The Art of Living around that time.
Sure. Yep.
So it was Sharon Lebel's book and then Tom Wolfe's novel that I think may have fueled the Stoic comeback, let's say. I'm a literature graduate. And so it was through that novel that I encountered Epictetus again, and then being at Nicopolis, started reading him. But I didn't appreciate him at all. He's, pretty much, kind of a mansplaining philosopher, right? Is this real blokey guy, just like, and it wasn't an attractive philosophy for me at that time. So again, I kind of ignored the Stoics, and after that, sort of did some travel and kind of developed this odd, very extreme fear of death about a decade ago. And I was quite the hypochondriac, going to doctors all the time, just worried about everything, had everything wrong with me, and was Googling online, how to respond to fears of death, how to deal with that, and came across Donald Robertson's online course on death contemplation. And so it was via Donald Robertson where I learned about modern Stoicism, Stoic Week, did my first Stoic Week in about 2015, 2016. It took me about three attempts of Stoic Week. And by the way, everyone's Stoic Week is on in November this year. So do register. So it's a week of just, living like a Stoic, doing Stoic exercises with Tim LeBon and Eve Riches. Anyway, so did Stoic Week. And then because of that real human need to kind of heal my soul and try and work out what's going on with this death obsession and death fear, that I finally kind of connected with the Stoic teachings. but still really struggled reading Epictetus. And then I hadn't read any Seneca and hadn't read Marcus Aurelius until about, a decade ago. And then read Marcus Aurelius and again really struggled with that. But it wasn't until I read Pierre Hadot, and I read Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life. And he has a chapter in that called Spiritual Exercises, and really talks about writing and just the Stoic practice that kind of really opened me up to Marcus Aurelius. And I read Marcus Aurelius in the Gregory Hayes translation. That still is my absolute favorite translation. And in the introduction to that translation, Gregory Hayes has a little section on Marcus Aurelius's writing style, and talked about how Marcus Aurelius was writing his notes to himself. And he's really just, in Gregory Hayes's terms, re-expressing and reformulating and kind of rethinking and rewriting the Stoic teaching. So he's not doing any original philosophical work. He's not really trying to teach you anything. He's just working through the teachings on his own, trying to rephrase them in a way that will really strike his soul vividly, so that he can keep them at hand, as Epictetus would say, keep the teachings at hand. And so that really, being a natural writer, really spoke to me. And so I was able to really appreciate Stoicism through Marcus Aurelius. And interestingly, there was a literary critic who sort of said that Marcus Aurelius was like kind of the worst writer, just so not poetic, so interesting, etc. And I thought that's so interesting, because one of the things that I couldn't quite connect with the Epictetus works written by Arrian, who, obviously so much gratitude for him to take some excellent notes from the teacher, was the lack of poetry in Stoicism. It was just so bland, and so for me, a literature grad, etc., it was quite a difficult way to connect. But if you read Marcus Aurelius, there are some really stunning images, beautiful metaphors, and through metaphor, etc., I can really kind of then connect with the teachings. So that helped me deal with my death anxiety, and I've since gone on to develop a program called 28 Days of Joyful Death Writing with the Stoics. And that's a program where, you just get 28 daily prompts from Marcus Aurelius. And it's an invitation to contemplate death, etc. I know we're going to talk about death contemplation later, but so my Stoic practice has really developed, and I've kind of tried to bring in my creative writing interest and curiosity and talent, let's say, into my Stoic practice. And that was a really long-winded answer. But yeah, I might pause there for a bit, Judy.
And it's interesting you mentioned about Hayes's translation. I personally find Hayes kind of misses a lot of Marcus's poetry, and that's why I've still got a really soft spot for George Long, with his Old Testament vibe from 1862. I mean, I guess every translator is doing something slightly different, but for me, Long preserves Marcus's poetry in a way that a lot of the more recent translators, and you can see why. I mean, they're bringing Marcus to a wider audience every time. It's a Marcus for the masses to some extent.
Yeah,
but I think something gets lost, and I think some people do come away with the impression that Marcus is a banal writer when nothing could be further from the truth. So it's really interesting how you found this critic suggesting what a bad writer Marcus is. Tell me this critic's name. I'm going to follow that up.
I'll have to go back and find that, because I just, what a shame I can't remember. But to add to your comment about maybe Hayes's kind of more banal approach, one thing in favor of that approach, and one thing that I came across again, I think through Donald Robertson, an article that he wrote, and if anyone's interested listening, you might just Google Donald Robertson, how Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, and I think he mentions his tutor Fronto, who I think I'm right in that, mentions that Marcus Aurelius is really, again, as Gregory Hayes points out, is rewriting, re-expressing the teachings to to himself. So almost using a kind of personal language to speak to himself. Because Pierre Hadot uses the term rhetorical amplification in that process, where you really pay attention to word and syntax and sound and meaning, because the teachings have to speak to you so that you can memorize them and keep them close to you and almost ingest them. So language plays a key role. And I think what Gregory Hayes was doing was kind of doing what Marcus Aurelius was doing, kind of re-expressing. So it's not so much even a translation per se, but it's a re-expression and a reformulation in a kind of modern speak that spoke at least to Gregory Hayes and might speak to others. And in this death writing program and some of the other programs that I've led, we really try and get to, I really invite everyone to kind of reformulate the teachings in their own words, being careful not to change the subject or not to make Stoicism Epicureanism or something else. But that process of writing and rewriting seems to help with memorizing and really ingesting the teaching so that they can almost become our default way of being in the world and responding to things. So yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? But I've actually started reading, and I never learnt Greek formally, and I certainly don't know Marcus Aurelius's Greek, coined Greek, but have started reading a couple of years ago Marcus Aurelius in the Greek. And if you read it online on the Perseus site, you can click on words and it opens up this Greek word tool. And it's a really nice way of engaging with the text originally. And even some non-Greek speakers in my group, I have a little group called the Stoic Salon. Some of us are going back to the Greek text, and then it's really interesting just exploring what words meant then, etc. So it's a fun play with words as well. Yeah, Judy.
That sounds great. I mean, I'm a great fan of Marcus's Greek, and it's kind of idiosyncratic. And I've got a theory that he's actually he's writing Greek as he might write Latin. So that's just a theory of mine. But he brings the kind of the Latin compression to Greek in a kind of a unique way. I think he's a really unique stylist. But there's also an overlap from what you mentioned earlier about Ed Spence. So Ed's a friend of Stoicon Melbourne, and a couple of years ago, I think, or maybe it was our last Stoicon, Matthew Sharp, who's obviously the translator of Pierre Hadot, did a review of Ed's book, Caught in the Web. That's what it's called, isn't it? AI, Stoicism and the AI Problem. Yeah, so we're familiar with Ed's work, and yeah, isn't it wonderful how the Platonic dialogues, such as this symposium, just lend themselves to dramatic performance, and that brings it, as it brought you to a whole new audience. I'd love someday if we could do it.
Let me just say a quick thing about Ed. He calls Socrates a pre-Stoic, which I think is just lovely.
Well, exactly. And of course, Socrates was such a key influence on the Stoics, and particularly Epictetus. So yeah, it all fits together really well. So one thing that I know you've mentioned in the past and talked about is the role of women in Stoicism. There's not just obviously one role, but would you like to say something about women and Stoicism?
Yeah, I'll try. It's quite an interesting subject, and I guess somewhat controversial. I've been reading a recent study, and I'll bring it up in a second, but the study quotes a book called History of Women Philosophers, which was written in 1690 by Giles Menage, I think. And he reported that there were no women in the books of the ancients, so no ancient women were writing Stoic philosophy. And he said that that Stoic philosophy probably didn't appeal to women because of its the Stoic ideal of apatheia, so like freedom from emotions, being that women were so emotionally engaged, that Stoic philosophy wouldn't appeal to women. That Stoic philosophy was a very manly type of, that there was a manliness around Stoicism, being sort of focused on eliminating the passions, let's say, and also Stoicism focusing on kind of manly or masculine attributes such as reason and self-governance and freedom from the passions, etc. So there's this kind of, and that was 1690. So I think there is that lingering sense that Stoicism is more of a manly philosophy because of those traits. And I think you can see that in modern day sort of pop Stoicism. I often look at the branding and the coloring. It's very black and gray and very muscly and masculine. And there are these statues that represent the Stoics. Of course, we don't have images of the ancient Stoics. So it seems to me a very rigid, like it just externally, it could be something that might not appeal to women, let's say, and I'm using quotes again. So I think that's really interesting. There is evidence, of course, of and sort of indirect evidence that women were engaged with Stoic philosophy. So we have translations made by women. We know that there, women owned Stoic texts and kind of read them. And so there's all these little videos online on YouTube saying, yes, women were around. Yes, women really did like them. Yes, women's voices were heard in Stoicism. But that's kind of men telling us that we liked Stoicism. So it's kind of indirect evidence, like all the men out there on their little YouTube videos saying, yes, you did like Stoicism. And that's fine. But I came across a study recently, and it was published in May 2023, this year, by two female authors who looked at direct evidence of women incorporating Stoic ideas and teachings in the 1600s. And by direct evidence, they mean they looked at women's letters, poetry, moral essays, notes, etc., and found a kind of distinct version of Stoicism coming through in that direct evidence. And so, for example, there's evidence of women using sort of Stoic philosophy to deal with children and how to parent. There's evidence of women using sort of Stoic philosophy and practicing Stoic philosophy to survive the institution of marriage, for example, or to live in difficult marriages. And of course, back in the 1600s, it was really difficult to leave a marriage. Women were owned by men, both financially and bodily. And I think the vibe was that it was because of women's own fault that they had to be controlled or protected by men because they were weak and emotional creatures. And so there's evidence in these texts, in this study, of women trying to gain an individual sense of freedom through Stoic philosophy or through Stoic therapeutics. So picking up on all the pop stuff, like living in agreement with nature, dichotomy of control, and also trying to manage emotions and tame desires. So that comes through. But the authors of this study also find that women report a kind of a distinct version of philosophy. So really focusing on empathia, so developing positive emotions of respect and friendship and care and joy in relationships. So trying to establish marriages that are based on friendship rather than the patriarchal model, which is control, dominance and submission. So really interesting sort of explorations of how to become friends in a partnership. And the authors kind of say that this is a very distinct model of kind of very distinct female narrative around Stoicism. And that really blows me away because, as you know, Brittany Polat and I co-hosted and co-organized 2 women's conferences. And just quickly, everybody, you all know Brittany Polat. She's a member of Modern Stoicism, a board member of the Stoic Fellowship, wrote a book on parenting, tranquility parenting, has a recent great book called Journal Like a Stoic, which is a 90-day journaling program. So go out and find it. It's fantastic. We're actually working through it in the Stoic Salon. We took a break over the summer, but if you want to join us, just reach out to me and you can join us. We're going to continue. And Brittany also writes a great Substack called Stoicism for Humans. Okay, that's Brittany. So Brittany and I hosted and organized the first women's conference. And what we found was, the idea was that we're going to have a women's conference and we're going to invite women to speak. And we invited one man, the lovely Greg Sadler, but we invited Greg because he was the husband of a woman, so Andy Sharker, and together they talked about love and marriage. So we put the invitation out to women, not really knowing what the topics were going to be. And just organically, the program evolved and we talked about care and parenting. We talked about love and marriage. We talked about creativity. So it almost seemed as if by giving a voice to women and allowing women to choose which aspects of Stoicism were going to resonate and they were going to speak about, we chose subjects that weren't typically discussed at kind of a Stoic conference, I think. And of course, through that process, Brittany Polat connected really deeply with Eve Riches, and together they formed Stoicare. So again, in 2021, putting women on the stage and giving women the microphone and say, hey, talk about Stoicism, we brought out topics that were kind of distinct to us. So we talked about positive emotions. We wanted a really joyful conference, a kind, warm conference. And it's remarkable because coming across this study of women in the 1600s who also brought out this notion of empathia, so like really developing those positive emotions of friendship and care, etc. We kind of mirrored our ancestors in a way. So maybe the female narrative is a kinder, more community openness about sort of looking at care and emotions, and even looking at how Stoicism can help us build long-lasting, kind, mutually respectful relationships with the partners in our lives. I think I probably went off on a bit of a tangent, but let me I just had a quote here that I wanted to mention. It's about using Stoicism, so for women who are in difficult marriages. And I guess it kind of pertains to us today as well, because we're often in very difficult relationships sometimes, not just, romantic relationships, but work relationships are often fraught with difficulties. And I think obviously today we have the freedom to get a very legal and happy divorce. But at the same time, we might want to endure difficult situations because we feel that might be the most virtuous and sort of prudent thing to do depending on our circumstances. Now, of course, the Stoics aren't prescriptive. They don't tell, there's no one size fits all for everyone. We have to kind of do some self-examination, work out what is the right thing for us to do. But anyway, in one letter, I think, a woman is talking about living in a really difficult relationship with a tyrant of a husband. And she writes, the tyrant man may still possess the throne. 'Tis in our minds that we would rule alone. Those unseen empire give us leave to sway, and to our reason private homage pay. So this sense of, nurturing one's reason in order to live freely in even some difficult relationships. And of course, relationships back then were much more difficult. At least you couldn't leave them so easily as you can today. Big tangent, but Judy, back to you. I don't know if any of that was interesting.
I'll have to get that reference for the study from you, because that sounds really, really interesting. So thank you for introducing us to that. It's not a tangent at all. I think it's perfectly valid. And we can note too that it's not a more caring kind of collegiate kind of Stoicism isn't exclusively, for women. And Will Johncock's most recent book is evidence of that. He really brings out those aspects of Stoicism, which are always there. They just don't tend to get emphasized so much in the pop pop versions of Stoicism that are around. But yeah, it's there's so much in Stoicism that is collegiate, that is community. I mean, Seneca says there is no philosophy that is so friendly and communal, essentially, and I think we can certainly approach it that way. We've mentioned that you're a writing coach, and I know you have a set of writing practices, but would you like to give us some idea of how you think writing can be therapeutic?
Yeah, that is such a big and hard question. You did mention at the beginning that I am currently enrolled in a Master of Science in creative writing for therapeutic purposes. I've just completed my first year, and starting my second at the end of September. It's really broadened my perspective and deepened my practice. So I think the programs that I've to date delivered will become much more interesting and focus more on a therapeutic, being more therapeutic interventions. Stoic therapeutics. Stoicism is a therapeutic philosophy. The end goal is eudaimonia, a sense of flow, a sense of doing well, of being well. Stoicism is a way of pulling yourself out of worries and concerns in order to focus on maybe the objective, more human, bigger picture. And how can writing help us do that? Well, writing, I guess, is one activity or practice as part of a bigger sort of philosophical practice. And so let me go back to how I started rethinking writing as a therapeutic intervention. The Gregory Hayes, of course, was one of the initial things. So the idea of rewriting the teachings was really interesting to me. And then Pierre Hadot's chapter, that wonderful chapter, Spiritual Exercises, in his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. In that chapter, Pierre Hadot references Philo of Alexandria, who was a sort of Hellenistic Jewish philosopher and who looked at kind of merging Platonic philosophy and Judaism. And he recorded 2 lists, it seems, of practices, spiritual exercises, philosophical training exercises that one could do as part of this Stoic therapeutic practice, Stoic Platonic practice. And those activities include writing, but also include things like reading, study, attentiveness, meditation, mindfulness, dialogue, practice, so practice out in the real world, and memorization. So taking those activities, I thought about how writing can assist us in, helping us keep the Stoic teachings close at hand. And one of the practices includes copy work. So literally copying the texts. So it's a way of just being mindful with the text. So one practice is to just have the Marcus Aurelius, look at one of the segments and just quietly and patiently copy it out word for word on a bit of paper or in a journal. And so that process of just copying words out is therapeutic in itself. So it can just keep you centered. We talk about in meditation the anchor, and in sort of typical meditation, breathing is the anchor. So you're breathing, you keep coming back to your breath, and that keeps you kind of focused and grounded and anchored in the present moment. If you're doing a writing meditation, then just copying, say, a Marcus Aurelius extract that's the anchor. So the act of just writing and just paying attention to the sound and movement of the pen on the page. That's remarkably therapeutic. Just that sort of saying, hey, I'm just going to sit and really listen and pay attention to Marcus Aurelius and just write the words down. One other thing that's really important is memorization. So we need to be able to memorize the teachings so that when you go out into your day, you have them in your head. And so writing can actually help you with memorizing texts. One in the practice that I do, we do some copy work, then we pull out maybe a key phrase or a keyword, or try and memorize a fragment of the meditation. So when we go out into our day, we'll try and recall part of a meditation throughout the day. So that's really important. One other activity that we've done is create our own personal enchiridion. So, Epictetus kind of said, write things down and have them at hand. And of course, Arian wrote the enchiridion, the handbook, down. And so it's kind of a portable document of the teachings. And so we produced a enchiridion. So if there's a specific concern, like say, for example, you are finding it hard to tame your anger, you might want to look through the Marcus Aurelius, pick out segments or teachings pertaining to anger, and then copy them and then rewrite them and rephrase them and reformulate them, as Gregory Hayes says Marcus Aurelius did, and just collate them into a handbook, little pocket-sized handbook. You can literally carry it in your pocket, in your handbag, and you will always have it at hand wherever you are to kind of pull on it and look at. So yeah, I think I'll just pause there for a moment if there's a follow-up question or if I'm making any sense whatsoever about writing as a practice.
So much sense. I mean, the process of writing is it's an intimate activity between the brain and the spirit and the motor activity. I was kind of reminded of this earlier in the year when I broke my wrist, and it was my writing hand. And the day after I broke it, I thought, right, I'm going to start using my left hand. And I started copying out the opening sentences of Jane Austen novels, as it happens. And that whole exercise was incredibly powerful in that, yeah, it's all about focus. You focus in a way that you wouldn't otherwise do it. I must have read those opening sentences so often, but just writing them, I paid attention in a whole new way. And yeah, it really gets you to see the text in a fresh way with new eyes, as Seneca says. That's the aim of so many of these practices is to view our reality as if we're fresh to it, because that is the part of the transformation in us.
Yeah. And there are also some technical ways you can do that. So Marcus Aurelius often, doesn't really use the first person. So it doesn't say, I felt this or I did that. And a lot of modern day journaling and the prompts that, if you buy sort of a journaling book with prompts, the invitation is usually to talk about yourself. And so modern day journaling is really about the self, and we kind of position ourselves as this protagonist in this drama of life, and everything revolves around us. And studies in sort of mental health, etc., sort of suggest that the more enclosed you are, the more enclosed in this circle of the self that you are, the more difficulties you have with mental health and anxieties and fears, etc. The more you can broaden that perspective and literally pull yourself out of yourself, it's literally just relieving and therapeutic and opening up, etc. And so you're no longer, everything doesn't depend on you if you do that. And so that Stoic practice, the view from above, that just pulling away and rising up and just seeing yourself from above, is so liberating, because suddenly you see that all the little petty things that depend on you, and what you said and what you should be guilty about, and all these little things that you worry about, kind of replicated around millions and millions of other souls and minds. So your concern is tiny if you look at it from above. And you can do that in writing as well by shifting person. So it's just a technical thing. Instead of saying I, you say you, or you could even do we, which is kind of a more communal sense. But Marcus Aurelius often uses kind of the second person, or at least in the translations, it's translated as the second person. I'm not sure how that really works in the Greek. So that process of saying, sorry, Judy?
I was just going to say, I think that's literally what he's doing. Yeah, I think it is in the second person.
Yeah.
A lot of the, because it's kind of exhortation. It's instruction. So yeah,
instruction. Yeah, and so it's almost, and so the CBT uses that distancing technique. So you're literally taking a step back from yourself and saying, "You can do this. You." And one of the activities that we do in some of my programs is start with the personal, because we're very used to talking about ourselves in the first person. So start with the personal and then re-express that in the second person. And so then sort of looking at what happens. And so looking at the therapeutic arc. So going from that really closed, neurotic, narrow view of the self to a more expanded view of the self using the second person is in itself a therapeutic journey. And so that's interesting as well. Yeah.
Oh, this is so interesting and so fruitful. So yeah. So
yeah.
I'll just move on to one thing you've touched on already, which was your practice around death. And as part of Stoicism, we do try to be mindful of our own impending death and that of our loved ones and other people. So can you maybe give us some thoughts about meditating on death, as the Stoics might do?
Yeah. One thing that I didn't know about death anxiety and death phobia is, and it's going to sound so silly, but I just didn't make that connection. It's actually very closely linked to our state of mental health. So the more you can accept death, finitude, impermanence, the more enhanced is your mental health, the better mental health you have. And some psychologists suggest that all the phobias and anxieties that we have, our anxieties about, social anxieties, work anxieties, any anxiety, financial anxieties, all the anxieties are just kind of proxy anxieties for the big anxiety, which is death anxiety. So we really, really need to get better at facing our personal death, our death of others close to us, and just the concept of finitude, the concept of impermanence. And one thing that I found just intuitively when I developed this death writing program, at one point I called it joyful death writing. And it just seems like such a contradiction, like joyful death writing. And of course, I don't mean that death is necessarily a joyful thing, like, yay, I want to die. That's so cool. But what happens when you are able to contemplate your death is that you develop a sense of lightness and a sense of joy in living the life that you have right now. So contemplating death is a practice that I think if we take just one thing from and it's not just, of course, the Stoics that do that, the Buddhists do that, and Buddhists have these meditations where you literally focus on your body. And I think Marcus Aurelius actually kind of does that too. You focus on your body dissolving, dying, and wrinkling up, and then going back to the earth. So you have really, really strong meditations on sort of contemplating that. And Marcus Aurelius talks about kind of the return. So death is like not a loss, but a return to the universe, the world, in some form, atoms. Anyway, so death contemplation. I think I've used death contemplation on a very banal level and a very high-end existential level. So at the banal level, creating a death deadline. So saying, end of this week, end of this month, I'm going to die. So let's have a think. Let's survey what life should be like before I die. So you can do, and I've used death contemplation to lead goal-setting workshops, and even to motivate creative writers to focus on a creative writing project. So death meditation really helps you decipher and sort of differentiate between what is really core to you and what isn't. And the therapeutic aspect of Stoicism is really, again, to pull you away from concerns and worries about day-to-day life, and to really focus on how to be the most virtuous person you can be. I live by a cemetery, as you mentioned, or as I mentioned earlier. And one thing that and it's odd because I've lived near cemeteries. Even I lived in Boston as well and lived near a cemetery there. And Scott Perry, who is also a Stoic and has sort of contributed to Stoicism Today, the blog, Modern Stoicism blog, he does a daily run around a cemetery, and that keeps him grounded and focused as well. And he's a coach as well, and often uses the idea of finitude and mortality as part of his coaching philosophy. Yeah, so Judy, do you want to ask me anything else? I think I'm going to pause there for a moment, and just maybe you could help me get back on track.
Oh, that's fine. No, and you're absolutely right about the cemetery. I mean, having that visual, and it's not just visual, but it's a physical environment where you are reminded of the lives of people in the past, and if we're fortunate that the headstones aren't too worn away, you can actually learn about who they were, what their names were, and that is kind of good scene setting for us in context for our lives, because we will be as they are, and it's there's a big community of the dead out there, I suppose, is part of what I'm getting at, that one day that we can form relationships with when we're reading long dead writers, but also to reflect that one day we'll be joining them. So it's I think it's a very fruitful and productive way to approach the ideas. Look, we've been talking.
Let me just add one more thing.
Sure.
Now that you've just added that, I have this. So Epictetus, of course, suggests, and it's quite controversial. He suggests that when you are engaged with a person that you care for, a loved one, even your child, to just briefly in your mind look at them and just say, tomorrow you will die. So to have this kind of sense of their mortality in that moment when you're really engaged with them and you really love them and you really want to be with them. So to think about their mortality as well. And I'm just thinking, we gather together as groups, either at work, around sort of in meetings, or on Zoom, or we gather together socially at the bar or wherever people gather. And there's a book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. And the idea is that all these cultural activities that we do, our work and our going out and our plays and music, etc., are kind of buffers. They're kind of buffering us from the shock of mortality. But I wonder whether we can bring in Epictetus's "tomorrow you will die" when we meet people. Like, instead of saying, "Hey, how you doing?" we could say, "Hi there, tomorrow you will die." Or you're having you're in a corporation, you're having a meeting, and it's like, "Welcome everyone to our meeting today, and just let's take a moment to focus on the fact that tomorrow we might die." So imagine if we sort of started our gatherings with that moment of reflection of our own mortality, our own finitude, the impermanence of things. I think that would revolutionize the way we gather. What would a meeting at work look and feel like? What would petty disagreements be like? You wouldn't spend your time on that because, hey, tomorrow you might die. I might die. So let's just really get to what is right at the moment. Let's pay attention to what we really need to get done today. So I'm just thinking that would just be a really interesting, or even in the morning when you wake up and say, good morning, you want some coffee? You'd be like, hey, tomorrow you will die. All right. So let's enjoy that coffee. Let's really enjoy this coffee.
Exactly.
Let's really just enjoy this coffee. Yeah. Anyway.
Absolutely. Well, we're kind of almost getting around to the hour. So I might, what I really would like to ask you about is probably two more of the questions that I had on my list. So I know you're a very keen dog person, and that you have made statements in the areas of animal welfare. And I just want you to talk about what animal welfare means to you.
Yeah. Yes, my little animal just popped in and just plotted herself down on the floor there. So animals, yeah, another quite controversial issue. I think we don't need to worry about what the Stoics thought about animals 2,000 years ago, because that was then, and everyone back then thought of animals in a particular way, irrational beasts. But I mean, people thought about that about women and children as well. So women, children, animals were kind of grouped together as just, irrational, weak, sort of more primal characters, humans, beings. And we don't need to worry about that, because today we know things about animals that people 2,000 years ago just didn't know. So in terms of intelligence, and there are studies done that show that, I mean, I think we've inherited this kind of idea of intelligence as a hierarchy. So we're, as humans, at the top. So men are at the top, then women, then children. Animals are kind of below us. But that sort of hierarchical model of intelligence is not meaningful anymore. I read an article in New Scientist that looks at intelligence as kind of this sort of spider-like structure, where you've got like birds and then humans and then octopus and then like a fish. So intelligence kind of is just different. So we have to think about intelligence and sort of rationality in a different way. So there's that argument about animals. And also the fact is that we live with animals in very intimate situations, and that is what it is. So how can we enhance those relationships? So we've been living with dogs, for example, for thousands of years, and dogs have evolved in ways to be able to communicate with us. So they have like facial features, and they do these little eye fluttering things that just say, yes, yes, I'll bring you your snack right now. So dogs have evolved to live with us, and we've been living together for thousands of years. And that reminds me of Marcus Aurelius's note in book 2, section 1, where he says that human beings are born to work together. Well, I kind of feel that, dogs and humans have been living together domestically for thousands of years. Therefore, we too have been born to kind of work together in a way. So how can we enhance those relationships? That's something to think about in terms of living with animals. And, I think it just makes sense that Stoics and people in general wouldn't necessarily want to harm an animal if you didn't have to. So that impacts on our dietary culture, the meat industry, the milk industry, how are animals being treated there, and what is the wisest and right thing to do in that case. And of course, again, the Stoics are not prescriptive. You choose how you express virtue, what virtue means to you, and how dealing with animals is right for you given your means, whatever it is, religion, etc. But I think there are lots of questions that we can seek answers from through our Stoic practice with regards to living well with animals and developing and enhancing those relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right, because in Stoic theory, the humans are very specifically situated as part of the animal kingdom. Okay, they're animals with reason, and so they are placed in a different category from that point of view. But there's no question that the Stoics considered humans as in the network, I guess, of the animals. So I just want to ask you too about what you've been working on with Stoicon and this theme of beautiful Stoics. It's just such a fruitful theme. Did you want to tell us something about what's going to be covered and some of the ideas and speakers that you are going to bring forward for Stoicon?
Yeah, well, I hope everyone here, I think this is airing after Stoicon, so Stoicon's
That's right.
about a week earlier. Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, it will be recorded, so everyone here will be able to follow up on that. So beauty, yes. I think that, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier about me having a liberal arts background, so literature and you know, music and the arts really have imprinted on my soul as something very key and very important for me as a human thinking being. But one thing about beauty that you, I guess, so first of all, let me say, yes, Stoicon, beauty, that is the theme. And when we think about the Stoics, we don't think about beauty as being important because it's considered a indifferent. Certainly it's a preferred indifferent. But basically, we need to cultivate a sense of detachment or indifference to beauty because it's not a direct path to virtue. And that might suggest that we shouldn't care at all about beautiful things. And I wondered about that because the draw of beauty is so strong. Like, we recognize beauty and we want beautiful things, and beautiful physical things, beautiful people. We're just drawn to that, aren't we? It's just such an attractive thing. We kind of recognize it intuitively and spontaneously. We have a very spontaneous reaction to it. So how does that fit into the Stoic philosophy? And of course, lo and behold, the Stoics have a very fruitful theory of beauty. Of course, a lot of it comes from Platonic thought, but there is a book written by Isti Chelkite called the Stoic Theory of Beauty. Now, Isti studied at the University of Edinburgh, wrote her dissertation, it became a book, and Isti will be talking at the conference. And she proposes that the Stoics do have a distinct theory of beauty. They add something else to it that you don't get in the Platonic kind of version or other kind of ancient versions of beauty, and that is the quality of functionality. So what that means, and you're going to have to kind of listen to Ice-T's talk to really get it. This is kind of the pop brief version from me. But basically, beauty is a signal. It kind of draws your attention. It sort of invites you to pay attention to what's going on. So when you walk out, as Marcus Aurelius says that the Pythagoreans do, walk out in the morning and kind of witness the heavens, and you see everything is just out there and it's beautiful and it's in order. You've got the moon or the stars and the heavens look quite beautiful. But what does that mean? What is that asking you to think about? And it's basically really drawing your attention to the fact that the universe, the heavens, let's say, are ordered. So there's an order, and potentially for the Stoics, well, there's a rational order behind that. So beauty is revelatory in that sense. It kind of asks you to pay attention to the truth behind it, let's say. This is really simplistic, everybody. So I find that absolutely fascinating and really excited to explore beauty as a revelatory, and this is just one aspect of it. There are other sort of aspects that come up in and will come up at the conference. So IC is talking about this distinct quality of beauty. The keynote speaker is John Vervaeke, who will be talking about why rationality needs beauty. So linking so beauty almost as a compass to, or pointing you to, cultivating virtue, wisdom. And John Sellers will be talking about some paintings, Rubens. Greg Sadler will be talking about, beautiful things, the things that we have. How are they beautiful? What can we think about them? Jennifer Baker will be sort of helping us try to rationalize around beauty. Yes, it's an indifferent, but it does have value for the Stoics. It might not have as much value as virtue, but it's certainly a valuable thing. And Brittany Pollack will be talking about moral beauty, and David Feidler will be talking about the environment. So how can we make our environment more beautiful? And so it's going to be a really interesting theme. We don't often have a theme at Stoicon, but I really wanted to have a theme, and thank you to the Modern Stoicism team for allowing me to kind of explore this. And so that should be really interesting for Stoics to explore.
Oh, it sounds absolutely fascinating. What an absolutely stellar lineup. So congratulations on your hard work to bring this about. Look, I've just got one more question I think would be great to get your view on. And that's, what's your favorite Stoic virtue and why?
Oh, right. Yeah. So I probably will say courage. And Brittany Pollett and I, the second women's conference was about courage. And that was really specifically a very personal choice for me, because I just felt myself just not feeling as courageous as I probably ought to have been. I don't know, pressures of being like this courageous being. But I learned through that conference that you can't just pull out a virtue and say, hey, this is my favorite virtue, or this is the virtue I'm going to work on, because all the 4 virtues are inextricably linked. So you've got you can't really be courageous unless you're also wise, kind of thinking carefully about what the courageous choice is. And sometimes what was interesting for me is that courage is an action, but courage might also be a non-action. It might actually be just pausing and thinking and contemplating and just checking. And that you can't really be courageous unless you're also thinking about other people. So we have this romantic idea of courage being like the single warrior going out and risk-taking and doing stuff. But I think we also need to pay attention to what our courageous leaps into the unknown, how they might impact the people around us. So we need to be fair. So we need to cultivate the virtue of justice. And also moderation is interesting. A lot of sort of pop courageous acts are really these big bombastic acts of absolute sheer powerful courage. But sometimes courage might be just a way of just balancing oneself in a difficult situation. So it might not look bombastic, or Hollywood might not write a movie about it, but it's courageous in a very subtle, wise, quiet, balanced, fair way. And that was quite interesting for me to kind of see that in that context.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. Look, I think we might wrap it up. We've been going for an hour. It's just been so wonderful to have this conversation, Kathryn. And I just want to say finally, if our audience wants to check out your work or find out more about what you do, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so just to Google my name and I'll come up somewhere, and you'll find an email address and you can contact me. I'm pretty much the only Kathryn Koromilas that will come up. So, although I might have a cousin somewhere, but yeah, please do contact me if anything that I've said was kind of a bit, I'm constantly learning. So, contact me if anything I said is a bit off, or you want to engage in a conversation or join the Stoic Salon and we can do some work together. Yeah, I'd love to hear from everybody, and I wish I was down under. But have a great Stoicon-X, everyone.
Look, thank you so much.
And thanks,
for your
Judy,
time.
for the conversation.
Thanks so much, Kathryn. It's been great. And I look forward to the big Stoicon, as we call it. Take care, Kathryn.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Judy. Bye.
Bye.